I'd like to show you another game from the bullet match between Alireza Firouzja, the 16-year-old Iranian prodigy, and world champion Magnus Carlsen. Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and do consider supporting us on PayPal or patreon.com. PowerPlayChess, you'll see the links in the description down there. Right, let's crack on with this game. Once again, it is Firouzja with the white pieces, and you can see that Carlsen, well, in the other game we looked at, Carlsen played this very strange kind of Alikins defense that kind of led to a fairly orthodox position. This time Carlsen is playing the Sicilian Najdorf with black, and Firouzja really goes for it. He plays the move which I think is the acid test of the opening, bishop g5. Now, although Carlsen might not often play mainline theory, actually he knows it pretty well, and he understands that this is really perilous. And if black just gets it slightly wrong, you can just get destroyed. Nothing, particularly in bullet chess, which is all about the initiative, then this is so dangerous for black. So Carlsen sidesteps. He plays g6, so this takes the game into very different paths. Now, if black is allowed to play the standard bishop g7, then we get a kind of strange dragon variation, which certainly isn't bad for black. Of course, the problem with g6 is that white can exchange on f6, which breaks black's very nice pawn structure, leaves this pawn isolated, leaves this square weakened so that white may be able to drop a piece on that square. But on the other hand, so what's Carlsen got for this? Well, he's got two bishops, and there is always the possibility just to give up that pawn with f5, and then that bishop will burn down the diagonal. So although, you know, objectively this must be good for white, of course in blitz, any faster time control, this is really tricky. And in bullet, well, who cares? On with the game. Bishop c4 played. And castles kingside, good practical decision from white. Frankly, you don't want to go queenside here, not with that bishop on g7. And bishop b3 from Firouzja. You could go queen d2 and pile up on the d pawn very quickly. That might be the way to do it. But actually, already, black has a very decent position. This is, well, let's say counter chances. You know, there is potential counterplay here, because there is also this open file towards the e-pawn. And you can see with that little bit of pressure on d4 with that bishop and maybe f5, things could open up. So, of course, with some kind of threat here to take and play f5, something has to be done about the knight. You don't really want to step back and allow f5. Then this is just a dream scenario for black. So knight e2 supports the knight, but already one can feel that, you know, black has counterplay here and a little bit of initiative. That's what you want in bullet chess. You haven't got time to think, you're playing on instinct, and it's all about the initiative. So Firouzja, I think, wisely doesn't want to play f3 because that would weaken these dark squares. Instead, bishop d5, which looks very fine. You're using that nice square in the middle of the board, except queen b6 is the reply, and suddenly Carlsen is getting somewhere. More threats on d4, potentially f5, and potential threat to take on b2, well, an actual threat. So the opening has worked out very well. So Firouzja defends against that one. Carlsen goes for it. He takes that pawn on b2. So often this is described as a poisoned pawn, this this raid on the pawn on b2. But here black can get away with it. There are just a couple of things. Well, that pawn on b7 is vulnerable, but that's not so serious. Pawn on f7. That is potentially the problem. And at this moment, Firouzja goes for it. So, there's no point in taking here and exchanging, because then black could take on e4 and it makes life easy. Instead, rook c1. It's all about the initiative, remember. And actually, white does have very active pieces here. The queen has gone on a spending spree, but drops back. Good square, because that prevents the rook coming down to c7. So Magnus is alert. He didn't stay on a3. But it does allow queen b3. And you can see how things are turning. Well, I'm not going to say against black, but certainly white starting to build some threats now. So Carlsen defends f7. And now f4. So potential to advance, and that would shut in the bishop here. And that would also shut this bishop in. So it's at this moment, this is an absolutely critical moment in the game where it could easily turn against black. If black makes a passive move, something like bishop d7, f5, that's very difficult. But Carlsen appreciates what the problem is and plays f5, opening up this diagonal. Whoops, I misfired. Let's try again. This is the freeing move that this whole variation relies on. If black doesn't get this in, it could be disastrous. But Firouzja has his eye on the prize and he just keeps going. And this phase of the game I think is very funny because both sides basically ignore each other. White is just gunning for the f7 pawn. And Carlsen now finds himself with a nice passed pawn. Now this is clever, he doesn't push immediately. What he does first is give a check. And only then push the pawn. So supported by the rook, this is pretty dangerous. Now the point is that checking vacates the g7 square and gives the king a safer square on g7 than it would be on, let's say, h8. So that was actually very alert from Carlsen. Knight f7. Both sides ignore each other. Who cares about this pawn? Let's take on f7. Now, with this diagonal about to be opened with a discovered attack, what do? Do you play king g7? No! You carry on. Just carry on. Let white make his moves. Just carry on with the plan. Knight d6, discovered check. The king steps up to g7. It's on a much better square than would be on h8. Rook e1. And now, well, Carlsen needs to connect his forces. He recognizes that. His forces at the moment are rather disconnected. That bishop is loose. The rook, of course, is doing a good job supporting that pawn, but these pieces are the problem. They need to join in the fight. So bishop g4, excellent move. And h3 seems very reasonable because it gives the king an escape square, of course attacks the bishop. Not so obvious where that bishop could go. Actually, Carlsen plays, I think, what's a good practical move. Again, it's one of these cases where he's just ignoring his opponent and creating threats of his own. And rook d8 is certainly not bad. But let me just point out a funny move. Here, the best move for black is actually to play h5. Maintaining the bishop on g4, protecting that pawn, and black actually has a very strong position. The point of playing h5 is that if this is taken, then you can see all of a sudden there is a deadly attack on the king here. And g3 gives the king a square, but then rook d8, and it's rather similar to the game, but basically this is a much better version. Anyway, I'm just pointing it out, just for fun. It's a nice move. But Carlsen played rook d8, which is also very natural. Remember, it's all about the initiative, about creating threats. Knight takes b7. And white carries on. Knight fork. So black takes the bishop on d5. And now we have some exchanges. And pawn takes bishop. So at the end of that, Carlsen is the exchange down, but he does have this superb pawn on e2 supported by the rook. The king's a little bit exposed, and straight away he's got bishop f2, which actually wins back the exchange. You might spot this idea to put the queen on h4, but remember the queen can come across here. Now there is one try which is very interesting. I have no doubt that Carlsen saw rook e3, threatening the queen and threatening mate, but actually white has a good reply, and that's to check. If the king goes back, of course, there's rook c8, and if the king goes up, then, well, there's no danger any longer, and in fact, there are even mate threats now, like that. So, I mean, who knows whether this was just a kind of sixth sense, or whether Carlsen saw that rook e3 was a bit dubious. But anyway, he played bishop f2, the best move. And here, white basically has a draw by perpetual check on these diagonals. Queen c3 check, and now queen b3 would repeat the position, and I think a draw would actually be quite a logical conclusion to this game somehow. Incidentally, white can't, let me just show that actually. White can't take that pawn here because of queen h4 mate. That really wouldn't be good. Got it in. But so I think a draw after queen b3 would be the correct result. But instead, Firouzja played queen c8. So what possessed him to play this move? I have no idea. Probably because he was ahead on time, I'm guessing. So this was taken. And now the rook, whoops, the rook needs protecting. So this rook came back. And now black has the upper hand. You don't take here straight away. g3, the king has to come out. And here, well, Carlsen played the most practical move. He's obviously, racing and took the rook. In fact, bishop h4 is the best move because that maintains the threat. This rook can't escape. The king cannot approach the pawn, and then this king will march into the position. That's the basic idea. Should be good for black. Instead, Carlsen took on e1, which is just, with nothing on your clock, it's the move you're going to make, really, and then bring the king. And here, this is very funny, because Firouzja took on e2, and he'd obviously anticipated that Carlsen was going to take on f4, winning a pawn with some winning chances, and then he would play the king to g3. Now, he'd obviously done a pre-move of king g3, anticipating rook takes pawn check, but Carlsen took the rook on e2, and because it was a pre-move, then the move had to stand, and king g3 was played on the board. Carlsen was a rook up, and Firouzja resigned or lost on time or whatever. There we go, a very comical end, but actually quite typical for bullet chess, where actually, you have to make pre-moves to sometimes just, be faster on the clock. But let's just come back to this position. After rook takes rook, of course, the king can take. And then after, or should I say, should take the normal move. After h5, you might think, oh, well, maybe a few winning chances with a distant passable, and even that's a draw. But actually, king f3 is just a draw. Stone cold draw. Nothing going on there at all. Anyway, so yes, Firouzja won the bullet match overall, but well, Carlsen, it was a close enough match, and Carlsen had his fun as well. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. I thought they're actually very instructive, so who knows, we might see some more of those on the channel. Thanks very much for watching.